Hello, Jerry here. Welcome back to the Old Testament prophets. Now, last week we began the book of Daniel with chapter 1, and Daniel and his three friends, among many other young and bright men, were taken to Babylon from Jerusalem to become advisors concerning Judah. But more than just advisors, educated and loyal to Babylon. These young men would receive a first-class education in everything Babylonian, and hopefully the king will win their hearts and minds as well. And God did two amazing things with Daniel and his three friends. He honored their faith at keeping the Mosaic dietary law, so that after 10 days of a plant-based diet, they looked better than their peers on the king's calorie-rich diet. So they were allowed to maintain their plant-based diet. And second, God graced them with abundant understanding and wisdom on their education, so that they were even 10 times better than the king's wise men, the pros. How encouraging that must have been for Daniel and the three others. God was with them and blessing them. Now we're ready for chapter 2. But let me mention one interesting fact now, rather than interrupting the story later. In the middle of the chapter, chapter 2, verse 4, the language of Daniel changes from Hebrew to Aramaic. Aramaic was the court and trade language of Babylon and that whole area. It was how these nations communicated with each other. Daniel and his three friends have learned two languages, the Babylonian, Akkadian language, and Aramaic. Aramaic will continue from Daniel chapter 2 through Daniel chapter 7. Chapter 2. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Notice the plural is used of dreams. But then later, both Daniel and the king refer to this in the singular, the dream, which means that this one message or vision was repeated exactly in more than one dream occurrence. Definitely a message from heaven. But as we'll see, the dream vision clearly needed interpreting. Dreams were considered highly significant in the ancient world as a way in which the gods kind of whispered to humans in enigmatic ways. And for leaders, strong dreams may well be hints or early warnings about the future, so leaders must understand them to anticipate future challenges. Both the Egyptians and the nations of Mesopotamia, which included Babylon, had dream books. They were written by priests with sample dreams and common themes and their meaning. For instance, orientation was important, the direction that things happened. There is this conflict between good and evil all around, and the good is in one direction and the bad is in another. All the universe was divided between good and bad. That's typical thinking and magic and superstitions. But that's not how God's universe is in reality. So in a dream, and I quote the tablet, if he gaze toward the right, his adversary will die. If he gaze toward the left, his adversary will overcome him. And also, if he look toward heaven, there will be his undoing. If he look toward earth, he will be blessed. Actually, reality is much more complex and unpredictable. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Now this included magicians, a word from the word stylus or engraver. So those perhaps who officially engraved and published astrological movements, such as on clay tablets or temple walls, the enchanters or conjurers, They used spells and incantations to connect to the spirit world, which was probably very similar to the sorcerers using magic and spells to make things happen. Finally, the Chaldeans were an historic class of wise men from southern Babylonia, the old guard. And we'll notice that it's always the Chaldeans who were the spokespersons to the king. As we'll see, it was very important that they were all there. The king had not slept the rest of the night, and all these experts in the kingdom probably got the urgent call early that morning. And I'm doubting all of them were ever called in for his normal dreams. That would be overkill. But now he summons everyone. Though Daniel was not in this group, which is also very important for this story. The Jewish captives had just graduated, and while they were under the umbrella of being wise men of the court, they probably were more limited to matters concerning Judah, at least at this point. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. He begins the reference, or rather here, this begins the reference to a single vision given, where he uses the singular dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Now, as I noted, this is where the book slips into Aramaic. And given the dream book of Babylonia, I quoted, we can imagine the process that they would use to interpret the dream, assuming they had cataloged correctly all the themes of the gods and where and in what was good and evil. But their whole premise of reality was fabricated, not true. And then the bombshell. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. Let me quick note that the King James translates verse 5 very literally. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream, and so forth, which is a good literal translation. This has led some to think that the king had forgotten the dream and wanted to be reminded. But I think the modern translations catch the idiom, it has gone out from me, was a way of saying this was my final decision. What I've said. It's done. But this is a minor point. Either view works, so whichever view you have is fine. This dream was of such importance that the king made a crucial decision. He must know the true interpretation, but how could he discern the true interpretation from something made up? So the king came to the idea that since the gods had sent him the dream, the gods could also send the content of that dream to one of his wise men, along with the interpretation. He would know who has the true interpretation from the gods, by who also who has heard from the gods the dream content. It's unorthodox, but it did have a good logic to it. Of course, all the wise men could not come up with the dream content. So they answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation." One last time the king repeated the demands. He won't again. But he adds some discerning words. "You're stalling, hoping the circumstances will change." And then the accusation, "You all have been in cahoots all along, telling me made-up interpretations." I like how the Message paraphrase puts this. The king said, "I know what you're up to. You're just playing for time. You know you're cornered. You know that if you can't tell me my dream, you're out and out doomed. I see right through you. You're going to slap together some fancy stories and confuse the issue until I change my mind. No way. First tell me the dream, then I'll know you're on the up and up with the interpretation and not just blowing smoke in my eyes." Well, I'm sure you could have heard a pin drop. They came in just for another day in the court, but suddenly they are exposed for what they cannot do, and the most horrendous death awaits them. However, the wise men have two last flimsy appeals, which probably won't work, but it's all they had. First, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean." This was unprecedented. No other powerful kings have ever demanded such of their wise men. But really, how much did Nebuchadnezzar care about what other kings have done, especially in his state of rage? But their second plea is of great interest to us. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. The sovereign Lord was in this, because the wise men were pushed to the brink of disaster, and they were forced to admit something they never would have otherwise. Think how all the various pagan spiritual leaders postured themselves as being close with the gods, able to discern divine omens, to have visions, to interpret dreams and visions. The priestly wise men class in the ancient world almost always commanded a lot of clout and respect for their connection to the gods. This well is deep in sinful human nature. Think of the New Testament Pharisees, who made a show of their spirituality, how intimate they were with God, but Jesus exposed them as whitewashed tombstones. Still today, all spiritual leaders, Christian and otherwise, fight the temptation against portraying an inspiring, close relationship with the divine. However, in this case, when the king forced them to give the specific dream content, they had no choice but to admit no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. To possibly save themselves from a torturous death, they admitted only the gods know, and actually, they don't talk with us. We're truly sorry if we unwittingly gave that impression. This opens a huge door against their credibility, against their whole profession and all their previous interpretations. In the sovereignty of God, not only had the king made this hard requirement, but also Daniel was not in the group that was called in. If Daniel would have immediately revealed the dream, all those spiritual wise men would not have been driven to the edge of the cliff where they confessed this. And they would have jumped on Daniel's wagon. That's exactly what we came up with also. Their confession that they could not do this was foundational to what God was going to do. Because now all the so-called wisdom of these many ranks of wise men were thrown out. setting the stage for God to show what he can do. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. This confession was the king's worst-case scenario. He had already harbored doubts about the wise men, hence his demand to tell them the content. But for none of them to be able to get the dream, and then for all of them to admit they cannot do stuff like that, that's the worst. The king is pressed between the absolute urgency to interpret this divine message and his whole worthless priestly class who can do nothing. It's a terrible time to discover their deceit and lack of power at the one time he really needs them. And so, in kingly fashion, he flies into a rage and demands the whole lot of wise men to be killed in the worst way. For their years of deception, the executioners would tie their limbs to powerful animals and they would be torn apart. Then their homes demolished, which means their whole families shamed and put out on the streets. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Daniel and his 3 friends were recent inductees to the category of wise men. Welcome to your new position. Now we have to kill you. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Daniel's like Joseph, isn't he? He has a God-given winsomeness. Arioch's job was to round up all the wise men for execution. Daniel wisely speaks to him. Why is this decree so urgent? And that word urgent has or can have the nuance of harsh or severe. The NIV translates this harsh. Arioch takes time to share this story with Daniel, and Daniel went into the palace and requested an appointment with the king, which was before God revealed to him the dream. Time was of the essence. God was stretching Daniel's faith. Daniel had a sense that God put him in this situation and believed God could give him the answer needed. I think the Lord was using the very recent positive interview with Daniel and the king, because the chronology is very tight here. There's just barely enough time for all these things to happen: their education, the interview, the vision. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Well, here's a very serious prayer meeting, that God would have mercy and spare their lives. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God, my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and said to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, "I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation." Now, the reason Daniel went first to Arioch instead of the king was probably that Arioch at any moment was going to execute all the wise men. Daniel didn't want to be talking to the king while people were being executed. And so he said to Arioch, "Don't destroy the wise men, but instead bring me into the king." And Arioch was also a way for an immediate entrance of Daniel to the king, who brought Daniel in with a bit of overstatement. "I found him for you," when actually Daniel found Arioch on this, and he had already made that appointment. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" Now, listen carefully to his nuanced answer. Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be." This is so interesting. Daniel even knew from God what the king was thinking as the dream came. You were reflecting about what would be happening in the future, and then God gave this vision. "But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind." So one more qualification here. I'm not the great one here. God is working so that you can know the interpretation of this dream. Is this king on the edge of his royal seat or what? Now, up to now, Daniel has only given a teaser. He knew what the king was reflecting about that night, and he knew that the vision concerned the future. But does he really know the content of the dream? "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image." He does know. And look at the time. Lord willing, we'll look at this vision next week. We need to see it as a whole. But what have we seen so far in Daniel? God was building a man of faith and using him to speak to a pagan king and nation, Babylon. But also remember the Jewish readers who will follow Daniel and his friends into captivity in Babylon very soon in the second and third deportations. They are going to be seeing how God was still at work through his people. These stories will greatly encourage them. So these amazing stories will get around, and quickly, I'm sure. Then the Lord will put Daniel's book in the canon of Scripture, where we all read it today. Daniel, as a young man, could hardly have realized the far-reaching spiritual effects of his faith in these hard times in Babylon. After all, he was just living in real time, just as we are. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.